In this video, I'll be talking about qualitative risk analysis. So what is qualitative risk analysis? It's a method that allows us to assess and evaluate the characteristics of individually identified project risks. So the focus over here is on individual project risks, and it allows us to prioritize risks based on agreed upon characteristics. Now, these characteristics are defined by the organization, and it's a reflection of things such as the urgency of the risk, how risk averse um, or risk loving a particular organization is, and the probabilities and the impacts that are perceived by that organization. The qualitative risk analysis approach is based on a probability of occurrence and an impact of risk on individual project objectives. Now, on this point, I want to highlight that it's a misconception to think that because it's a qualitative risk analysis, there's no sort of numbers that are involved. There are numbers that are involved, but they're not very specific in the sense that they're usually on a scale, and that scale would be defined both for the probability and for the impact of the risk on the individual project objectives. Now, in terms of the questions that the analysis would attempt to answer, well, an important one would be what are the impacts of each risk on the project objectives? As I said, the focus would be on individual risks and how they impact these individual objectives. So over here, we're not assessing the overall impact of the risk. We're not looking at a combined effect of the risk. We're just looking at how individual risks impact project objectives. Now recall that the project objectives would be defined based on you know the particular the particular projects that would be uh, that would form the portfolio of the organization. So in a construction organization, you'd have various commercial, residential, maybe infrastructure projects, and would be objectives set out for these for each individual project. So an example of an objective would be finalizing projects on time or within budget. So these would form the objectives. And we're trying to see over here with a qualitative risk analysis, we're trying to see how individual risks would impact these project objectives. Now, when we compare a qualitative risk analysis with a quantitative risk approach, in a quantitative risk approach, we're looking at the overall impact of the risks. So an overall impact, a combined impact of all these risks on all the project objectives. In qualitative risk analysis, we're just concerned with that one single risk and how it impacts certain, objectives. And then maybe we'll come up with an index that groups all of that together, not from a combined approach, just like what we would do in a quantitative risk analysis, but we're looking at, like a very simple addition maybe of individual indices that form the overall impact of risk. The output, when we're looking at a qualitative risk analysis, it will give us a list of risks in priority order. So we'd have, risks classified as high, moderate, and low. Now, moving on to the process. So what's involved in a qualitative risk analysis? The process can be broken down into 5 main steps. And you start off by looking at the list that you've obtained from your identify risk process. So you recall that in the identify risk process, the risk register would have a list of risks. From that, that's where the process starts. So the qualitative risk analysis approach starts from that list of risks. So what's the 5 main steps? You can see on the screen in front of you the 5 main steps. First step is to select the risk characteristics. Second step is to collect and analyze the data. Third step, prioritize risks. Fourth step, categorize the risk causes. And then finally, document the results. Let's start off by looking at select the risk characteristics. So the risk characteristics, as I said, they're defined by the organization. And they're done in a way where you'll be able to distinguish the risks that are important for response or for further analysis from those that are less important. And you do that based on the criteria that's specified by top management in an organization. So the criteria will reflect the probability of occurrence of a risk to that organization and the degree of impact on the objectives. defined for that specific organization. Now remember, the organization can be involved in several projects, so we'll have to look at, a construction organization will have to look at, commercial, residential, and infrastructure projects that it is involved in, and then decide upon a suitable scale for its probability of occurrence and for the degree of impact on objectives that would be defined across the projects that it would be involved in. The second step in the process involves collecting and analyzing the data. When it comes to collection, it's about, assessing individual risks. As I said, for the qualitative risk analysis approach, you have to be aware of bias in data gathering, and that's why it's best to always have an expert judgment. And the approaches that we'd adopt for data collection, you can do that through interview, so you can interview various stakeholders that are involved in a project to identify, the risks, workshops, and then reference the databases of prior projects. Now, these were all steps. You'd recall that these were all steps that you would have covered in the identify risk process. The third step is prioritizing the risks by probability. So your company or your organization already has defined certain criteria for ranking risks, and it's based usually on how each risk would affect the specific project objectives. So you'd rank, the risks identified by probability and impact on the specific objectives. Now remember that there will be an uneven impact of risks on various objectives. So for example, one risk can highly impact your cost objective, whereas it won't have much of an impact on your on other objectives that you'd have. So say for instance, maybe time or maybe efficiency or something like that. When you're looking at a qualitative approach, as I said, we're looking at single risks. And so it's about, that single risk prioritization that's involved. So that's a list that you would come up with. Now, the single risk prioritization index does not look at the interaction of all risks here. That's a function of a quantitative risk approach. So more sophisticated simulation analysis would be required for that. However, you can achieve an index that reflects the preference of the organization, and you could do that by sort of grouping these different single risk indices together. Now the importance of that would be for communication purposes. So if you want to communicate a certain concept or a notion about how risk how the project is impacted, how a certain project is impacted by the list of risks that you've identified to stakeholders and to management, they'd probably prefer a single index that gives them, an idea of how the risks impact the projects, rather than having to have a look at, each individual risk and its impact on each individual objective. But remember, for the case of in a qualitative analysis, it's always, we're looking at the analysis starts off by looking at single risks and how these single risks impact single objectives, and it's only an index, a representative index that we can obtain by combining, these single risks. So nothing very sophisticated. Any sophisticated analysis that requires a combination or an interaction of all risks and how that impacts the overall project objectives, that requires a quantitative risk approach analysis. Okay, so moving on to the fourth step, categorizing the risk causes. So several risks can be grouped together, and that's based on identifying the common root causes. So you could have three risks that are all related to one common root cause, and it's important to identify that common root cause because it allows us to develop effective strategies that simultaneously target multiple risks. Okay, and the fifth step is the documentation process, and that's the last step. So how do you document the risks? You document it based on the categories that you've identified in the previous step. So there's a list that you'd obtained from the identify risk process before you'd started off with the qualitative risk assessment. The priorities would be based now on the risks probability. So the individual probabilities, how it was perceived by the company or by the organization, and potential impacts on specific project objectives of that organization. And hence you'd, at the end of this process, you'd sort of update the risk register because you'd have a list of priorities now. What would you do with risks that have high priority? Well, the way that we'd look at it is we'd segregate, you know, these risks maybe for further analysis and response planning. The important thing to remember is that you need to monitor how the risks if update, or how the risks progress frequently, because we need to make sure, that any uncertainty that we weren't sure of at the start, we're able to cover it as the project progresses. When it comes to low priority risks, we definitely not ignore them. So even if you define something as a low priority for an organization, it's not smart to ignore this risk because it can eventuate into something massive later on. So it will be placed on a watch list, and you'd make sure, you'd watch for changes in status. And there's a very obvious example for us. We've gone through, COVID-19 and what happened to the whole world. So it's a risk that wasn't, it wasn't something that a lot of organizations had in mind, but some would have maybe identified that as a very low priority risk, and having had the chance to plan for it, you'd be able to deal with it better at the time when it does eventuate.